The wall behind me is already cracking. 50 feet of reinforced mana concrete, and it's coming apart like wet paper. Everyone else on my squad is either dead or crawling away, and I'm standing in the middle of the kill zone, with a monster core the size of a bowling ball, rolling toward my feet. And I do something that makes absolutely no sense. I pick it up, and I bite into it. Not eat it like a snack. I mean, I sink my fingers into a still warm, still pulsing wave-ender core, crack the shell like an egg, and press it against my mouth like it's the only thing keeping me alive. Because at that moment, it is. Somebody behind me screams my name. Ryo, what are you doing? And honestly, I don't have a clean answer. 20 seconds earlier, I was the weakest hunter in a 12-person disposable squad. The guy nobody wanted. The E-rank filler sent in to die so the real hunters could retreat safely. 20 seconds later, I'm the only one still breathing, standing over the body of a boss-class monster that outranked every single person who abandoned me, and my hands are shaking so hard, I nearly drop the core before I finish. That's the part nobody tells you about the moment your life changes. It doesn't feel triumphant. It feels like your body is doing something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I should back up. My name is Ryo Han, and 3 months ago, I was ranked dead last out of 11,000 hunters in my graduating class. Not close to last. Last. The examiners actually laughed when my results came in, because normally an awakening test gives you some kind of number, some kind of stat, some kind of dignity. Mine came back essentially blank. E-rank, the lowest tier that still counts as a hunter instead of a civilian, and even within E-rank I was considered a joke. My strength stat was so low that gym teachers hit harder than my strongest punch. My mana reserve was barely enough to light a candle, and not a big one. You'd think that would keep me out of the gates entirely. It didn't, because here's the ugly secret about this world that nobody puts in the recruitment posters. The association doesn't need strong hunters for every job. It needs bodies. Waves don't stop just because the strong hunters are busy somewhere more profitable. Someone has to hold the low-priority gates, the boring ones, the ones that don't generate headlines. And guess who gets assigned to those? E-ranks. Disposable ones. Me. I didn't choose this life because I dreamed of glory. I chose it because my little sister needed surgery that the state wouldn't cover unless I had hunter status. And hunter status came with medical benefits even at E-rank. That's it. That's the whole noble backstory. I wasn't chasing power. I was chasing a hospital bill. Her name is Meena. She's 14. She has a condition with her heart that the doctors describe in words I've stopped trying to fully understand. Because every time I ask them to explain it slower, all I really hear is expensive and ongoing and not optional. Before I awakened, our mother worked 2 jobs and still came up short every single month, and I watched her get thinner and more exhausted trying to hold our family together, with numbers that simply didn't add up. The day my awakening test came back, even at E-rank, even as a joke result the examiners laughed about, I remember calling home and hearing my mother cry on the phone, not because she was sad, but because for the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to be afraid of a hospital bill arriving in the mail. That's the version of me that walked into every gate for 3 months. Not a hero, a guy doing math in his head between missions, calculating how many more clearings he needed to survive before Meena's next procedure was covered. That's important context, because it means every time Draven called me filler, every time a squad leader crossed my name off a list like I was an inconvenience, I swallowed it. I had to. I wasn't fighting for pride. I was fighting for a 14-year-old girl who still texted me stupid jokes before every mission because she somehow believed, against every piece of evidence in front of her, that her big brother was invincible. So for 3 months, I got assigned to gate after gate, wave after wave, always in the back, always the first name crossed off when the squad got cut for efficiency, always the guy the guild leader introduced last, if he introduced me at all. My actual guild, if you can call it that, was run by a man named Draven Kessler, an A-rank ace with the kind of jawline that gets him sponsorship deals and the kind of ego that makes grown hunters flinch when he walks into a briefing room. Draven never once learned my name. He called me the filler for 3 straight months. Not cruelly, exactly. Worse than cruelly. Casually. like it wasn't even worth the energy to be cruel about it. There was one person who didn't treat me like background noise. Her name was Saren Cho, a C-rank support specialist with healing and barrier magic, assigned to the same disposable squads as me, because, in her words, somebody has to keep the fodder alive long enough to be useful. She said it as a joke the first time we met. By the second month, it wasn't a joke anymore. It was a promise. She kept me alive through 3 separate near-death situations that I genuinely should not have walked away from, and every single time she did it without expecting anything back, which, in a world this transactional, made her borderline suspicious to everyone else, and made her the only person I trusted completely. I want to be clear about something before I go further. This isn't a story about a secret genius who was actually strong the whole time and just needed a training montage. I was genuinely, mathematically the weakest hunter in my class. My stat sheet was an insult. What happened to me didn't come from hidden talent. It came from something the association buried on purpose, and I didn't find out what that something was until the day everything went wrong at Gate 17. Gate 17 was supposed to be routine, low-threat classification, minor wave activity, scheduled closure in 6 days. The kind of assignment senior hunters didn't even bother showing up for personally, which is why an E-rank filler squad got sent in to handle the final clearing wave, the wave that determines whether a gate seals safely or ruptures and dumps monsters directly into the city behind it. Here's the thing about final waves that the association doesn't advertise. They're called final because they're supposed to be the last and weakest surge before a gate closes on its own. Except sometimes, for reasons nobody fully understands, a final wave doesn't weaken. It escalates. It's rare. It's the kind of thing that happens maybe once in every few hundred gate closures. And when it happens, the association calls it a class anomaly, and by the time the classification gets updated, the hunters already inside usually don't get the memo in time. We didn't get the memo in time. I remember the exact moment the wave stopped feeling routine. We were 11 minutes into what should have been a 40-minute mop-up operation, clearing low-tier stragglers, when the ground under the gate chamber cracked open like a wound, and something climbed out that had no business existing in a gate this size. Our systems flagged it immediately, and the word that flashed across every hunter's status display in that chamber was a word none of us had ever seen attached to a live mission before: Wave Ender. For anyone who doesn't know the term, a Wave Ender isn't a monster classification exactly. It's closer to a warning label. It means the gate has destabilized past containment thresholds, and something has been born from the overflow, something built specifically to break through whatever's holding the gate shut. Wave Enders don't show up in routine clearings. They show up in catastrophic failures. And they had sent an E-rank filler squad, 12 people with a combined power level lower than a single mid-tier B-rank hunter, directly into one. Draven's voice came through the comm channel first, and for the only time in 3 months, he actually sounded rattled. "Fall back! Everyone fall back to the exit corridor, now!" Which would have been the responsible order if Draven himself hadn't already been the first one running toward the exit, shoving 2 lower-ranked hunters out of his way to clear his own path. That's when I understood something that I think, deep down, I'd always suspected. The people at the top of this system weren't protecting anyone below them. They were protecting themselves, and everyone else was expendable padding to buy them time. Saren grabbed my arm and started pulling me toward the corridor too, throwing barrier charms behind us to slow the collapse. And for about 6 seconds, it actually looked like we were going to make it out clean. Then the Wave Ender's tail came through the wall like it was made of tissue paper, and it caught 2 of our squad mates at the ankles and dragged them backward into the dark before either of them could even scream properly. I froze. I want to be honest about that. I didn't have some heroic instinct kick in. I froze completely, and if Saren hadn't shoved me forward, I'd have been the 3rd person dragged into the dark. We made it to the corridor junction, along with 4 others, while the remaining hunters scattered into side tunnels, chasing whatever exit they thought gave them the best odds. That's the part nobody tells you about a genuine catastrophic wave. It doesn't feel like a battle with a clear front line. It feels like a building collapsing while everyone inside makes individual, desperate, uncoordinated decisions about which direction might save them, and most of those decisions are wrong. The corridor we picked wasn't wrong exactly. It was just a dead end we didn't know about yet. We hit the far wall at a dead sprint, and found solid rock where the map said there should have been an emergency shaft. Gate architecture shifts during wave-ender events. Nobody had updated us on that either. Saren immediately started working on a barrier, hands glowing, sweat already running down her face from the mana drain, while the other 3 hunters with us started arguing about whether to double back through the collapsing tunnel or try to break through the dead end with brute force, which, with our stat sheets, was a fantasy. That's when the wave-ender found us. I've replayed what happened next more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean explanation for the order of events. I know Saren's barrier held for maybe 4 seconds against a full-force strike before it shattered and the recoil threw her into the wall hard enough that she didn't get back up right away. I know one of the other hunters, a shield type named Borum, tried to intercept the follow-up strike and got launched down the corridor so violently that I genuinely didn't know if he was alive when he stopped moving. I know the remaining 2 hunters made the reasonable, self-preserving choice to run, and I don't blame them for it, even though it left exactly 2 people standing in that dead-end corridor, facing something built to kill entire hunter squads. Me and Saren, who was down and bleeding and trying to push herself back up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment, because it matters for everything that came after. I had no plan. I had no hidden training. I had, by every measurement the association had ever given me, the weakest body in that entire gate. What I had was Saren on the ground behind me, and a monster in front of me that had already proven it could kill anyone stronger than me without slowing down, and something in my chest that simply refused to let my legs carry me away from her. I stepped in front of her. That's it. That's the whole heroic decision. I didn't calculate odds. I didn't have a strategy. I just stood there, between her and it, because the alternative wasn't something I could live with, even if standing there meant I wouldn't be living with anything at all. The wave-ender looked at me the way you'd look at an insect that wandered into your path. It didn't even bother with a full attack. It swung one claw, almost lazily, the kind of strike that should have ended things instantly, and then something happened that changed the shape of my entire life. My status window, the same blank, embarrassing, near-empty status window I'd been staring at in shame for 3 months, flickered, not glowed, flickered, like a dying light bulb catching one last surge of power before it either dies completely or comes back stronger than it ever was. Red text scrolled across it, text I had never seen before in any hunter briefing, any training manual, any of the countless status displays I'd watched other hunters casually pull up like it was nothing. Suppression field detected. Suppression field failing. Warning. Host integrity threshold approaching critical. I didn't understand what any of it meant in that half second. I only understood that my body suddenly moved in a way it had never moved before, sidestepping a killing blow by inches I shouldn't have had the speed to find, and my hand shot out and closed around the wave-ender's descending claw, like it weighed nothing. The monster actually paused. I want you to sit with that for a second, because at the time, I paused too. A wave-ender. A monster that had just casually thrown a B-rank hunter down a corridor like a rag doll, stopped moving because an E-rank filler grabbed its arm. Something was very, very wrong with my status window. Or, as it turned out, something had been very, very wrong with it for a long time, and it was only now starting to correct itself. I didn't have time to process any of that, because the wave-ender recovered from its confusion and doubled down with everything it had, and what followed wasn't a fight so much as a blur of instinct I didn't recognize as mine. I remember dodging strikes that should have killed me. I remember my own hands moving faster than my mind could keep up with. I remember, at one point, actually laughing, a short, disbelieving bark of a laugh, because some part of me finally understood that I wasn't dying in that corridor after all. The final blow came almost by accident. The wave-ender overextended on a strike, and I did the only thing that made sense in that moment, which was drive my fist directly into the glowing core embedded in its chest, the same kind of core every serious monster carries, the source of its power and its life. My fist went through like the creature's chest was made of wet paper, and the core came loose in my hand, still pulsing, still warm, and the monster convulsed once and collapsed. I stood there holding a wavender's core, in a dead-end corridor, with Saren staring at me from the ground with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, somewhere between terror and disbelief, and something that might have been hope. And then, because apparently the universe wasn't done with me yet, a second notification scrolled across my status window, one that would end up changing everything about how the association, my guild, and honestly the entire hunter world would end up looking at me. Class correction initiated. True class revealed. Apex Devourer. Suppression removed. Recalculating base stats. I didn't know what Apex Devourer meant. I didn't know why my status had been suppressed in the first place, or who had done it, or why. All I knew, standing there in that corridor with a monster core in one hand and my other arm helping Saren to her feet, was that the numbers scrolling across my status window bore absolutely no resemblance to the pathetic sheet I'd been humiliated over for 3 straight months. That was the moment my life stopped being about survival and started being about answers. Because if my true class had been buried on purpose, someone had made that decision. Someone had looked at whatever I actually was and decided the world was better off not knowing. And I was starting to get a very uncomfortable feeling about who that someone might be. But that discovery, the full weight of what it meant, didn't hit me until we made it out of the gate and back into the debrief room, where Draven Kessler was already spinning a story to the association liaison about how his quick thinking had contained the anomaly before it could breach containment. He hadn't accounted for one detail. Saren was standing right behind me, barely able to walk on her own, and she was not in the mood to let a lie like that stand uncorrected. "He ran," she said, loud enough that the entire debrief room went silent. Draven ran and left 2 squad members to die in a collapsing tunnel. Ryo killed the wavender, alone, with his bare hands. I want to tell you the room erupted into applause, that everyone immediately recognized what I'd done, and treated it like the miracle it was. It didn't happen like that. Instead, there was a long, uncomfortable silence, the kind where you can watch a dozen powerful people quietly deciding how a piece of information threatens them personally before they decide how to react to it publicly. Draven's expression didn't crack into shock or shame. It cracked into something colder, something calculating, and for the first time in 3 months, he actually looked directly at me, like he was seeing me for the first time. "That's impossible," he said, quiet enough that only the people closest to us could hear. "E-ranks don't solo wavenders. There's no version of that stat sheet that ends with you walking out of that corridor." "Yeah," I said, and I remember feeling something shift in my chest, something that had been small and quiet and apologetic for 3 months finally standing up straight. Funny thing about that stat sheet, I pulled up my status window in front of the entire room, right there in the debrief chamber, in front of association officials, in front of Draven, in front of every hunter who'd ever called me filler, behind my back or to my face. And when the numbers appeared, projected onto the shared display so the whole room could see them, you could have heard a pin drop. E-rank was gone. In its place, in letters that pulsed faintly like they were still adjusting to being visible at all, was a designation none of us had ever seen assigned to a living hunter before. Unclassified. Estimated threshold. Beyond current ranking system. The association liaison, a stiff, gray-haired woman named Director Meera Voss, went pale, in a way that told me this wasn't confusion. This was recognition. She knew exactly what she was looking at, and whatever it was, it scared her. "Get him to processing," she said quickly, already reaching for her communicator. "Immediately. Before anyone else sees this." That reaction, more than the fight itself, more than the numbers on my status window, is what told me the truth mattered more than I'd initially understood. Somebody in this system had gone out of their way to make sure I never found out what I actually was. And the moment I found out anyway, the people in charge weren't celebrating a hidden talent. They were scrambling to contain one. I should have felt afraid in that moment. Honestly, some part of me was. But underneath the fear was something sharper, something that had been building quietly through 3 months of humiliation and disposability, and watching people like Draven get rewarded for abandoning people like me. It was anger, clean and focused, and for the first time since I'd become a hunter, I wasn't planning how to survive the next assignment. I was planning how to find out exactly who had decided I deserved to be buried, and why. They took me to a processing facility that night, a sterile underground complex I'd never even heard of, let alone visited, tucked beneath the association's main headquarters. Saren wasn't allowed to come, which told me something else important. Whatever this facility was for, they didn't want witnesses. I was strapped into diagnostic equipment that looked more like something out of a classified research lab than a hunter medical bay, and for 6 straight hours, technicians in unmarked uniforms ran scan after scan on my status, my mana signature, my physical composition, occasionally muttering numbers to each other, in tones that ranged from disbelief to something close to alarm. Around hour 5, I overheard 2 of them talking in the hallway outside my room, thinking the door was soundproofed. It wasn't quite soundproofed enough. The suppression field was association grade, one of them said. This wasn't a natural anomaly. Someone installed this deliberately, at Awakening, 3 months ago. That's not standard testing equipment. That requires clearance above Director Voss's pay grade. Then who authorized it? That's the question, isn't it? I didn't sleep that night. Not because the facility was uncomfortable, though it was, but because that conversation kept looping in my head. Someone with authority above a regional director had taken a newly awakened hunter, identified something in me powerful enough to require deliberate, expensive suppression, and buried it so thoroughly that I'd spent 3 months believing I was the weakest person in my entire graduating class. That wasn't an accident. That was a decision, made by someone with the resources and the motive to make sure I never found out what I actually was. The obvious question was why? What was I, exactly, that scared someone enough to hide it? I got a partial answer 2 days later, when I was finally released from processing with a temporary classification, unranked, under review, and a strict instruction not to discuss what had happened at Gate 17 with anyone outside the association. Naturally, the first thing I did was find Saren and tell her everything. We met at a noodle shop 3 blocks from the association compound, the kind of low-key place hunters went when they wanted to talk without a dozen cameras and colleagues listening in. She looked better than she had in the debrief room, though there was still a fading bruise along her jaw from where she'd hit the wall. So, she said, once I'd finished explaining the suppression field, the overheard conversation, all of it. Somebody with serious pull decided the world couldn't handle you at full power and rigged your awakening test to hide it. That's either the best conspiracy theory I've ever heard, or the scariest thing that's happened to either of us. And honestly, it might be both. I keep thinking about the timing, I said. 3 months ago, right when I awakened. Whoever did this knew exactly who I was, before I even knew who I was. Saren went quiet for a moment, stirring her noodles without eating them, which for her was basically a warning sign that she was working through something uncomfortable. There's a rumor, she said finally, in the higher ranks. I've only heard fragments of it, because nobody talks about it directly. Something about the association keeping a registry of awakenings that come back with anomalous readings. Hunters whose true potential gets flagged as a risk instead of an asset. A risk to who? That's the part nobody says out loud. But if I had to guess, she said, meeting my eyes, a risk to whoever's currently sitting at the top of the hunter hierarchy. Because a hunter powerful enough to require deliberate, expensive, illegal suppression isn't a hunter. That's a threat to the entire ranking system, to the entire chain of command, to people like Draven, who've built careers on being ranked above people they'd otherwise be beneath. I sat with that for a long moment, letting the noodle shop's noise fade into background static, while my mind ran through the implications. If Saren was right, the reason I'd spent 3 months being humiliated, sent on disposable missions, treated as background noise by everyone around me, wasn't bad luck or bureaucratic indifference. It was intentional. Somebody had looked at whatever I truly was and decided the safest place to put me was at the very bottom, buried under a stat sheet designed to make sure nobody, including me, ever looked twice. I want to know what I actually am, I said. Not the version they let me see, the real one. Saren didn't hesitate. Then, we're going to need more than a noodle shop rumor. we're going to need someone on the inside. That someone turned out to be a name Saren brought up carefully, like she wasn't sure how I'd react to it. Meera Voss, a retired S-rank hunter who'd spent a decade training new awakened before quietly stepping back from active duty 2 years earlier. Meera had a reputation, even among veterans, as someone who didn't play politics, which in this world made her either an anomaly or a target, depending on who you asked. Saren had trained under her briefly and still kept an occasional contact. If anyone still has access to old awakening records, or knows how the suppression registry actually works, it's her, Saren said. But fair warning, she doesn't do favors for free, and she definitely doesn't do them for people she doesn't trust yet. We found Meera 3 days later at a private training facility on the outskirts of the city, a converted warehouse with reinforced walls and a training yard that still bore scorch marks from whatever S-rank sparring sessions had happened there over the years. She was younger than I expected for someone with her reputation, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of alert, evaluating stare that made you feel like you were being scanned the moment you walked through the door. "Saren Cho," she said, not quite smiling. "And you brought the E-rank who soloed a wave ender. Word travels fast in small circles." "Not E-rank anymore," I said. "Apparently." "Apparently," Meera repeated. And there was something in the way she said it, careful, deliberate, that told me she already knew more about my situation than she was letting on. "Come inside. Let's see if the rumor matches the reality." What followed was the strangest afternoon of my life up to that point. Meera ran me through a series of tests that had nothing to do with combat. Exercises designed to measure how my body absorbed and processed mana under different conditions, how my status responded to proximity with different types of monster cores, how my instincts reacted under simulated threat without warning. Halfway through, she stopped entirely and just stared at the readout on her tablet for almost a full minute without speaking. "What?" I finally asked, because the silence was starting to unsettle me more than any monster had. "Your class," she said slowly, "isn't just rare. It's a class the association officially classified as extinct almost 30 years ago, after the last known hunter carrying it was killed during what got recorded as an accident, but which several people who were there at the time believe was something closer to an assassination." The word hit the room like a dropped weight. "Assassination," I repeated. "Why would anyone assassinate a hunter for having a rare class?" "Because apex devourers don't just fight monsters," Meera said. "They absorb them. Every core you consume permanently integrates a fraction of that monster's power into your own stats, your own class abilities, your own physical structure. Most classes plateau. Yours doesn't have a ceiling anyone's ever confirmed, because every hunter who's ever carried it either died young in a gate accident or simply stopped showing up to their scheduled association evaluations and was never seen again." "You're saying people with my class have a habit of disappearing?" "I'm saying," Meera said, setting the tablet down and looking at me directly, "that a hunter with unlimited growth potential is the single most destabilizing thing that can exist in a ranking system built entirely around the idea that power has a knowable, controllable ceiling. Every guild contract, every sponsorship deal, every seat on the association council is built on the assumption that S rank is the top of the mountain, and that the people currently occupying that tier will stay there. You are living proof that the mountain doesn't have a top, and there are people in very comfortable positions who would very much prefer that proof stayed buried." End quote. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of my last 3 months rearrange itself in my head. The suppression field, the disposable assignments, the casual cruelty of being treated as the weakest person in every room I walked into. None of it had been random. It had been a slow, deliberate effort to keep me small enough that I'd never threaten the people who'd built their careers on a system where my true potential wasn't supposed to exist. "So who suppressed me?" I said. "Specifically." Meera's expression tightened, and for the first time since we'd walked in, she looked genuinely cautious. "That's the part I don't have proof of yet, but suppression fields at that level require Association Council authorization, which means whoever did this to you didn't do it alone, and didn't do it quietly. There's a paper trail. It's just buried under a lot of very powerful people who don't want it found." "Then we find it," I said. "We," Meera repeated, glancing at Saren, then back at me, and for the first time, something like the beginning of a smile crossed her face. You've got a lot of confidence for someone who was ranked dead last 3 days ago. I didn't have confidence 3 days ago, I said. I had a hospital bill and a bruised ego. Now I've got a reason. That reason took shape fast. Meera agreed to train me privately, off the record, while Saren worked her own contacts inside the association, trying to trace the origin of the suppression field authorization. What followed wasn't a montage of easy victories. My new stats gave me raw potential, but potential without control is just a different way to get yourself killed, and Meera made that point painfully clear in every single training session over the following 2 weeks. I got thrown across that training yard more times than I could count. I got humbled by exercises that should have been easy for someone with my new numbers, because my body and my instincts hadn't caught up to what my status window claimed I was capable of. Meera was relentless about it, in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of every coach who'd ever told me the truth, instead of what I wanted to hear. Your class isn't about brute force, she told me, after I'd failed for the 5th time to properly integrate a low-tier core I'd absorbed during a training exercise. It's about digestion. You're not just taking a monster's power, you're taking its instincts, its aggression, sometimes fragments of its memory. If you rush the process, you don't get stronger, you get unstable. There's a reason most apex devourers in history burned out before they hit 30. Power without control kills you just as fast as no power at all. The training itself was its own kind of humbling. Meera built drills that had nothing to do with what I expected from combat training. One entire session was spent with her forcing me to hold a low-tier core in my bare hands without absorbing it, just feeling the pull of it, the hunger it triggered, and resisting the urge to let it in, until she gave the signal. I failed that drill 4 times in a row, absorbing the core early each time, and each time she made me start over from a fresh core without a single word of frustration, just quiet, patient repetition, the way you'd train a muscle instead of scold a person. You're not being punished, she told me, after the 4th failure, when I finally snapped and asked her why she wasn't at least a little annoyed. You're being taught patience. Your body doesn't have yet. Punishment doesn't build patience. Repetition does. Other sessions were purely physical, sparring matches where Meera, even at retired, half-effort intensity, moved fast enough that I barely registered her strikes before I was already on the ground. She never held back the lesson, even when she held back the force. Your stats are lying to you, she said once, pulling me up off the mat for what felt like the 50th time that week. They tell you what your body is capable of. They don't tell you what your body knows how to do yet. Those are 2 very different numbers, and the gap between them is where hunters die. I started to understand what she meant the hard way, through bruises and failed drills, and a growing respect for a woman who could have coasted on her S-rank legacy and chose instead to spend her days getting thrown around a scorched training yard by an unranked kid with more raw power than control. Saren joined some of the sessions too, when her own recovery allowed it, mostly to work on synchronizing her barrier support with my new reflexes. And those sessions had a different energy entirely, lighter, more like 2 people rebuilding trust after nearly dying together, rather than a strict training regimen. She teased me relentlessly about how bad I still was at basic footwork, despite apparently possessing what Meera kept calling borderline mythological raw potential, and I let her, because it was the first time in months that being bad at something didn't feel like a threat to my survival. That warning stuck with me, because it explained something I'd started noticing myself. After absorbing the Wavender's core, I'd had moments, brief, unsettling flashes, where my thoughts didn't quite feel like my own. A flicker of predatory hunger that had nothing to do with food. A moment of pure animal calculation when I looked at a weaker opponent during a sparring match with Meera, something cold and evaluating that scared me more than any monster ever had. I didn't tell Saren about those moments right away. I wasn't ready to say them out loud yet, mostly because saying them out loud would make them real. I did eventually tell Meera, during a training break where it was just the 2 of us and a water bottle between us. She didn't look surprised. That's the price, she said simply. Every apex devourer who's ever existed has had to fight that hunger, that instinct that isn't fully human anymore. alongside every monster they were sent to kill. The ones who survived long enough to become legends were the ones who learned to control it instead of being controlled by it. The ones who didn't survive stopped being able to tell the difference between the two. That's not exactly reassuring. It's not supposed to be reassuring, Meera said. It's supposed to keep you careful. Careful hunters live longer than confident ones. I took that seriously, because I'd already seen what happened to hunters who got careless, and because underneath everything else, I still had a hospital bill and a sister who needed me around to pay it. But careful didn't mean slow, and it didn't mean I stopped digging for answers about who had suppressed me and why. Especially once Saren came back 3 weeks later with the first real lead we'd had. I found the authorization record, she said, meeting Meera and me at the warehouse with a tablet clutched so tight her knuckles were white. It took some very careful, very illegal database access. I'm not going to describe out loud, but it's there. The suppression order on your awakening test was authorized and personally signed off by council member Talos Greaves. The name meant nothing to me directly, but Meera's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Her jaw tightened, and something like old, controlled anger passed across her face. Talos Greaves, Meera said slowly, sits on the association's 5-member ruling council. He also happens to be Draven Kessler's primary sponsor, and the single largest financial backer of the current ranking and sponsorship system that funnels contracts, media deals, and public funding toward S&A rank hunters. A ranking system that only works, she added, looking directly at me, if the top of the mountain stays exactly where everyone currently believes it is. The pieces clicked into place with an almost physical weight. Talos Greaves hadn't just hidden a dangerous class from public record for abstract reasons. He'd hidden it because an unranked hunter with unlimited growth potential threatened the entire financial and political structure he'd built his power on. If word got out that the ranking system had a ceiling that could be broken, that S rank wasn't actually the top of the mountain, every contract, every sponsorship, every ounce of influence built on that assumption would be at risk. And I was walking, breathing proof that the assumption was a lie. So what happens now? I asked, when he finds out I already know. Meera's answer was blunt. Now, he decides whether it's more dangerous to eliminate you quietly, or more dangerous to let you keep existing where he can't control the narrative. Neither option is good for you. I didn't have to wait long to find out which option he chose, because 3 days later, an emergency association notice went out to every registered hunter in the region, flagging an unscheduled, unprecedented gate destabilization at Site 22, a gate the association had, until that morning, publicly classified as fully sealed and permanently inactive. The notice specifically requested the presence of unranked hunter designation Ryo Han as part of the emergency response team, citing his unique demonstrated combat effectiveness against Wave Ender-class threats from the Gate 17 incident. I stared at that notice for a long time before I finally understood what it actually was. It wasn't an emergency response request. It was a trap, dressed up in official association letterhead, sending me directly into a destabilized gate that a council member had personal authority over, under the exact conditions that had almost killed an entire squad 3 weeks earlier, except this time, there would be no Saren pulling me back from the front line if things went wrong, because the notice specifically requested I report alone. "Don't go," Saren said immediately, the moment she read it over my shoulder. "This isn't a coincidence. This is Greaves cleaning up a loose end and making it look like an accident." "I know," I said. "Then don't go." "I have to," I said, and I meant it, even though every rational part of my brain agreed with her completely. If I don't go, he finds another way, a quieter way. At least this way, he's doing it somewhere I can see it coming. Meera, who'd been silent through the whole exchange, finally spoke. "Or," she said, "you go, and you make sure he understands exactly what kind of mistake he made 3 months ago, deciding you were something that needed to be buried." I looked at her, and for the first time since Gate 17, I felt something settle into place inside me. Something that wasn't quite confidence and wasn't quite anger, but was close enough to both that it steadied my hands. "That's the plan," I said. Saren didn't like it. Meera didn't fully like it either, But 3 days later, when I walked alone into Site 22, the gate the association had sworn was permanently sealed, I wasn't the same person who'd been dragged into Gate 17's dead-end corridor 3 weeks earlier. I'd spent every night since then training with Meera, learning to control the hunger, learning to trust the new numbers on my status window instead of flinching away from them the way I had for 3 months of humiliation. The gate chamber at Site 22 was different from anything I'd walked into before. It had the sterile, deliberately isolated feel of a place built for exactly one purpose. And that purpose wasn't monster containment. Emergency response teams were nowhere to be found. Instead, standing at the chamber's center, flanked by 2 heavily armored enforcers I didn't recognize, was a man I'd only ever seen in association press photos, always smiling for cameras, always positioned at the center of every group shot like the sun everyone else orbited. Talos Greaves, in the flesh, looking exactly as composed and untouchable as every photograph had promised. "Ryo Han," he said, and his voice had the smooth, practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades convincing people to trust him against their better judgment. "I have to admit, I'm impressed you figured it out this quickly. Most hunters take years to connect these kinds of dots, if they ever manage it at all." "You suppressed my awakening," I said. There wasn't any point pretending otherwise, and I wasn't interested in playing whatever game he thought this conversation was supposed to be. 3 months of my life, humiliated, treated like garbage, sent on missions designed to get me killed, because you were scared of what I actually was. "Scared," Greaves repeated, tilting his head slightly, like the word amused him. "That's an interesting choice of framing. I prefer to think of it as protecting a system that has kept this city safe and functional for 2 decades. Do you have any idea what happens to a ranking hierarchy when the public learns the ceiling isn't real? What happens to the contracts, the sponsorships, the entire economic structure that keeps thousands of hunters fed and housed and motivated to keep risking their lives in these gates? Chaos, Mr. Han. Uncontrolled, unprofitable chaos. I made a decision, 30 years ago and again 3 months ago, that a single unpredictable variable wasn't worth destabilizing an entire system that protects millions of people. You didn't protect anyone, I said. You protected yourself, and Draven, and everyone else who's built a career standing on a lie about what the top of this system actually looks like. Greaves's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see the calculation underneath it. Careful, he said. You're standing in a gate I control, with enforcers I've personally trained, and a classification the association doesn't officially recognize as a legitimate hunter designation. If something were to happen to you here, the paperwork writes itself. That's when the chamber's walls began to shift, the same way Gate 17's architecture had shifted before the Wave Ender emerged, and I understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Site 22 actually was. Not a naturally destabilizing gate. A prepared arena, seated deliberately with monster cores strong enough to overwhelm even my new stats, dressed up as an accident that would look tragic and unavoidable, in whatever official report Greaves eventually filed. You've been planning this since the moment my status flickered in that debrief room, I said. I've been planning this since the moment your awakening test came back 30 years different from every prediction my analysts had ever modeled, Greaves said. You should be flattered. It's not every day a council member personally oversees your elimination. The floor split open, and 3 Wave Ender tier constructs emerged simultaneously, clearly artificial, clearly built and seated into this chamber specifically for this purpose, each one radiating a hunger and aggression that made the hair on my arms stand up. Whatever Greaves had spent his authority and resources building, it wasn't designed to be a fair fight. It was designed to be an execution. I want to tell you I wasn't afraid in that moment, standing alone against 3 constructs built specifically to kill me, orchestrated by a man with enough institutional power to make my death disappear into a filing cabinet. But fear, I'd learned over the last 3 weeks, wasn't actually the enemy. Fear was just information. What mattered was what you did with it. I did the only thing that made sense. I stopped thinking about survival and started thinking about everything Meera had taught me about control, about digestion, about turning hunger into precision instead of chaos. The first construct came at me fast, and for the first time since Gate 17, I didn't freeze. I met it head-on, and where 3 weeks earlier I'd relied entirely on instinct and desperation, this time I moved with intention, absorbing the impact through stances Meera had drilled into my body until they stopped feeling foreign, redirecting the force instead of just surviving it. My fist connected with the construct's core on the second exchange, not the first, because I'd learned patience costs less than desperation. The core shattered, and the familiar pull of absorption washed through me, and this time I didn't fight it or flinch away from the alien hunger underneath it. I let it settle, the way Meera had taught me, integrating instead of overwhelming. The second and third constructs came at me together, clearly designed to overwhelm any single target strategy, and for a moment, I genuinely thought I'd underestimated what Greaves had built. A strike from the second construct clipped my shoulder hard enough to spin me off balance, and the third followed up immediately, forcing me into a defensive scramble that ate up precious seconds, while my status window flickered warnings about integrity thresholds dropping into dangerous territory. That's when I heard it. Not a voice exactly. Something closer to instinct finally speaking a language I understood, the accumulated aggression and hunger from every core I'd absorbed suddenly aligning, instead of fighting against each other, and for the first time since Gate 17, I understood what Meera had actually meant about power without control, being just as dangerous as no power at all. Because in that moment, with control, everything changed. I stopped defending, I stopped scrambling. I planted my feet, let both remaining constructs close the distance, and met them exactly where Meera had trained me to meet. Overwhelming force. Not with more force, but with precision. The fight that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, though it felt considerably longer while I was inside it. I won't pretend it was clean or effortless, because it wasn't. I took hits that would have ended most hunters, and there was one moment, catching a construct's claw directly across my ribs, where I genuinely wasn't sure I'd stay standing. But I did stay standing, and when the dust settled, both remaining constructs lay shattered on the chamber floor, their cores dark and lifeless, and Talos Greaves was staring at me with an expression that had finally, completely, abandoned its composed mask. "That's not possible," he said, and for the first time, his voice actually shook. "3 constructs. Wave Ender Tier. You shouldn't have survived the first one, let alone all 3. You should have done better research before you decided I was disposable," I said, and I meant it as more than just a taunt. I meant it as a statement of fact about everything that had led to this exact moment. 3 months of humiliation, a suppression field designed to keep me small, an entire institutional apparatus built around the assumption that people like me existed to be sacrificed for the comfort of people like him. Greaves's enforcers finally moved, drawing weapons, clearly understanding orders to finish what the constructs had failed to accomplish. But before either of them could close the distance, the chamber's main entrance blew open, and I heard a voice I recognized immediately, sharp and furious, and exactly on time. "Step away from him," Meera Voss said, walking into the chamber flanked by Saren and, to my genuine surprise, 3 Association enforcement officers wearing the insignia of the Internal Oversight Division, the branch of the Association specifically tasked with investigating council-level corruption. "This is a private council matter," Greaves said, though the confidence had drained almost entirely out of his voice. "It was a private council matter," Meera said, right up until Saren Cho pulled the full authorization trail on an illegal suppression order and forwarded it to Oversight 40 minutes ago, along with a very detailed account of exactly what you were planning to do in this chamber today. I looked at Saren, standing just behind Meera, with her arms crossed and an expression that was equal parts furious and relieved, and understood, with a rush of gratitude I didn't have adequate words for, that while I'd been walking into what I believed was a solo confrontation, she'd spent every one of those 3 days building the exact evidence trail that would make sure it didn't end with a cover-up. "You suppressed a Hunter's Awakening test through illegal use of Association resources," one of the oversight officers said, stepping forward with restraints already in hand. "You orchestrated an unauthorized lethal engagement using seeded monster constructs against an unarmed, unaccompanied hunter under false pretenses of an emergency response request. Council Member Greaves, you're being formally detained pending full council review. I watched Talos Greaves, a man who 30 seconds earlier had spoken about my death like it was an inconvenient footnote in a filing cabinet, get led out of the chamber in restraints, his composed public mask completely gone, replaced by the furious, disbelieving expression of a man who genuinely never imagined the system he'd spent decades manipulating could turn on him this quickly. For a few seconds, none of us moved. Saren crossed the chamber first, ignoring the shattered construct debris still smoking on the floor, and pulled me into a hug so tight it aggravated the gash across my ribs, and I didn't say a single word about the pain, because after everything, I wasn't about to complain about her holding on too hard. "You absolute idiot," she muttered into my shoulder, somewhere between furious and relieved. "You told me you had a plan. You didn't have a plan. You had a hope and a hunch, and 3 weeks of training. It worked," I said. "That's not the same as a plan, Ryo. It's close enough." She pulled back just far enough to look at me properly, checking the cut across my ribs with the practiced, clinical focus of someone who'd patched me up more times than either of us wanted to count. And for a moment her expression softened into something quieter than the anger, something that looked a lot like she genuinely believed, walking into that chamber, that she might be too late. Meera watched the exchange with her arms crossed, and when Saren finally stepped back to let one of the oversight medics look at my ribs properly, Meera came closer, studying me the way she had that very first afternoon in her training yard, evaluating, careful, no longer quite as guarded as before. "You held control through all 3 engagements," she said, "even at the edge, even when the second construct nearly broke your defense. That's not something I taught you in 3 weeks. That's something you found yourself." "Didn't feel like finding anything," I admitted. "Felt like barely holding on." "That's what control actually feels like, most of the time," she said. "Anyone who tells you mastery feels comfortable has never actually needed it. It should have felt like victory. In a lot of ways, it did. But standing in that chamber, bruised and bleeding, and surrounded by the shattered remains of 3 constructs built specifically to kill me, I understood something that Meera confirmed for me a few minutes later, once the chaos had settled and the oversight officers had finished securing the scene. "This isn't over," she said quietly, watching Greaves get escorted out. "Removing one corrupt council member doesn't fix a system built to bury people like you. It just proves the system can be forced to acknowledge it when the evidence is undeniable enough. There are 4 other council members. There are guild leaders, sponsors, media partners, all of whom have spent years building careers on the assumption that the current ranking hierarchy is fixed and permanent. You just proved, publicly, undeniably, that it isn't. So what happens now?" I asked. Meera's answer came with a small, tired smile, the first genuine one I'd seen from her since we'd met. "Now, the entire hunter world finds out there's no ceiling on what's possible, and every single person who's built their comfort on believing otherwise has to decide how they're going to react to that." I looked down at my hands, still faintly glowing with the residual hum of absorbed power, still processing 3 months of humiliation, followed by one afternoon that had upended an entire institutional lie. Somewhere above us, the association's internal networks were already flooding with reports about what had happened at Site 22, about an unranked hunter who'd survived an assassination attempt orchestrated by a sitting council member, about a suppressed class that shouldn't have existed anymore, walking around very much alive and very much done being anyone's disposable filler. I thought about Draven Kessler, somewhere in the city, about to discover that the man he'd spent 3 months calling filler had just become the single biggest story in the hunter world. I thought about every other hunter out there right now, ranked E, ranked F, dismissed and disposable, and told their potential had a ceiling, wondering how many of them were carrying suppressed truths of their own. And underneath all of it, quiet but unmistakable, I felt the same hunger that had first surfaced in that dead-end corridor at Gate 17. Not the alien, unsettling hunger for monster cores, but something else entirely. A hunger to know exactly how far this could go. A hunger to find out what happened when a system built on a fixed ceiling collided head-on with someone who'd just proven that ceiling was a lie the whole time. Because Talos Greaves hadn't been the one who designed the suppression program 30 years ago. He'd only been the one who reactivated it. And somewhere in the association's buried, classified records, there was a name attached to the original decision. A name that predated Greaves entirely. A name that, according to the file fragment Saren had managed to pull before the trail went dark, belonged to someone who currently held a position far more powerful than a single council seat. Someone who was, as of that very morning, still very much unaware that their 30-year-old secret had just walked out of Site-22 alive, undefeated, and finally, completely done staying quiet.